In 1284, a city built on mudflats minted a gold coin called the ducat, 3.5 grams of nearly pure gold, and then did something almost no government in recorded history has managed. It kept that coin's weight and fineness essentially unchanged for more than 500 years, 5 centuries, through wars, plagues, bankruptcies, and the discovery of 2 new continents. The ducat stayed honest. It became the dollar of the Mediterranean, the money that merchants in Alexandria, Constantinople, Bruges, and London trusted without weighing. And yet, the empire behind that coin still died. Not in a battle, not in a siege. It was signed away in a single afternoon in May of 1797 by a room full of frightened aristocrats, while the most stable currency in human history sat untouched in the mint. How does a state keep its money perfect for 500 years and still lose everything? That question is the whole story of Venice, and the answer is sitting in a ledger. Picture the Rialto around the year 1500, not the postcard bridge, the market beneath it. Wooden benches set up in the open air, each one belonging to a banker, the banchi di scritta, the banks of the written word. A merchant walks up. He has just sold a cargo of pepper worth thousands of ducats, and the buyer is standing next to him. No coins change hands. No chest of gold is dragged across the square. The banker opens a heavy ledger, dips his pen, and moves the sum from one account to another with a few strokes of ink. Both merchants watch the entry being made. Under Venetian custom, the written line in the banker's book was the payment, legally final, witnessed in daylight. Fortunes crossed that square every morning and never made a sound. At its height, contemporary observers reckoned that the great Rialto banks held deposits from most of the city's serious merchant capital, and a transfer in their books settled trade from England to the Black Sea. Venice was not just a city with banks. Venice was a ledger with a navy attached. And for roughly 400 years, if you wanted to move serious money anywhere between Lisbon and Aleppo, sooner or later your transaction touched a Venetian page. So how does a swamp become the bookkeeper of the known world? Start with the absurdity of the place. Venice has no farmland, no forests worth the name, no mines, no fresh water beyond what its cisterns catch from the rain. The lagoon protected the city from armies, no cavalry charges across open water. But it produced almost nothing except salt and fish. Every grain of wheat, every beam of timber, every ingot of metal had to arrive by boat. That scarcity forced a choice early: trade or starve. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Venetian ships were running salt and slaves and timber east, bringing silk and spices west, and the city's government was already behaving less like a feudal court and more like a board of directors. Then came the windfall that changed everything. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade, financed and ferried by Venice, steered by the blind doge Enrico Dandolo, a man in his 90s who could no longer see the city he was about to enrich, turned aside from the Holy Land and sacked Constantinople, the richest Christian city on earth. Venice's share of the settlement was written with a straight face as 3/8 of the Byzantine Empire. 3/8, the treaty language called the Doge Lord of a quarter of the Empire of Romania. In practice, Venice took the ports and islands that mattered: Crete, key harbors in the Aegean, control points along the route to the east. It was the greatest one-time dividend any merchant republic ever collected, and Venice converted it not into palaces, well, also into palaces, but into infrastructure: naval bases, warehouses, customs posts, the skeleton of a trade monopoly. On top of that skeleton, the Republic built systems, and the systems are the real story. The arsenal, the state shipyard, could fit out galleys with assembly line speed. Centuries before anyone coined the term, Visitors wrote home in disbelief about hulls moving past stations of riggers and provisioners. The state organized the famous galley convoys, the Mude, armed merchant fleets sailing on published schedules to Alexandria, Beirut, Constantinople, Flanders. Cargo space was auctioned to merchants, escort was provided by the state, and departure dates were fixed law. A spice merchant in 1400 could plan a deal around a sailing, date the way a modern trader plans around a settlement date. Predictability was the product. The spices were almost incidental. And underneath the ships ran the paper. Double-entry bookkeeping. Every transaction recorded twice, debit and credit, so the books must balance or someone is lying, and spread through Europe largely from this region, and Venice was its showroom. In 1494, the friar Luca Pacioli published the first printed description of the method, and he described it explicitly as the practice of the Venetian merchants. Apprentices came from Germany and Flanders to learn accounting alla Veneziana, the way programmers once flew to Silicon Valley. The ducat gave the world a unit it could trust. The convoys gave it delivery it could trust. The ledgers gave it records it could trust. Stack those three kinds of trust on top of each other, and you get something close to a global financial operating system, run from a city you could walk across in an hour. Stand on the Molo on a sailing morning in the 15th century, and you could watch it work. Galleys rocking at their moorings, porters filing, up the gangplanks with bales of Florentine cloth and crates of German silver, clerks at trestle tables checking every bale against a manifest, the whole Mediterranean economy being loaded one ledger line at a time. At its peak, in the mid-15th century, Venice ran a merchant marine in the thousands of vessels by contemporary counts, employed tens of thousands of seamen and arsenal workers, and the historian Frederick Lane estimated the spice and Levant trade returned profits that no landed estate in Europe could touch. Nobody handling money in 1450 could imagine the system failing, which is usually the moment to start counting the exits, because in a single decade at the end of that same century, 2 ships and 1 sea route would knock the floor out from under all of it. The first crack came from the west, and Venice watched it happen in real time. In 1498, Vasco da Gama rounded Africa and reached Calicut on the Indian coast. The Portuguese had done what Venetian planners had quietly feared and publicly dismissed. They had gone around the ledger. Venice's spice monopoly rested on a choke point. Pepper and cloves moved through the Red Sea, and the Levant, through Mamluk and later Ottoman middlemen, and Venice bought at Alexandria and Beirut and distributed to Europe at a markup that paid for the whole republic. Da Gama's route skipped every middleman at once. The Venetian diarist Girolamo Priuli wrote, within months of the news, that this was the worst report the city could receive, that if the Lisbon route held, Venetian galleys would sail to Alexandria and find nothing to buy. He was barely exaggerating. Within about a decade, the spice volumes reaching Venice through the old route had collapsed to a fraction of their former level. Lisbon's pepper price undercut the Rialtos. The Levant trade later staged a partial recovery in the mid-1500s. Choke points die slowly, but the monopoly was gone, and monopoly margin was what the system was built on. Sound familiar? It should. Every financial center that has ever owned a choke point, a canal, a cable, a clearing system, a reserve currency, has told itself the route around is impractical, right up until someone sails it. The second crack came from the east and never stopped bleeding. The Ottoman Empire took Constantinople in 1453 and then spent 2 centuries grinding through Venice's maritime possessions, the very ports collected as the Fourth Crusade dividend. Negroponte fell in 1470. The War of 1499 to 1503 cost Venice its key bases in Greece. Cyprus, which generated real fiscal revenue, fell in 1571 after the horror of Famagusta. The War of Candia, The fight for Crete ran from 1645 to 1669, 24 years for one island, and by reasonable contemporary accounting consumed well over 100 million ducats, roughly 4 million a year, against a state whose ordinary revenues couldn't sustain it. Venice won battles in that long retreat, Lepanto in 1571 most famously. It lost the War of Attrition, because attrition is a contest of ledgers, and the Ottoman ledger was bigger. The third crack was self-inflicted, and it is the one that should make any modern financial center flinch. The Venetian patriciate, the closed caste of families who staffed the Senate and once staffed the galleys, slowly stopped going to sea. Through the 16th and 17th centuries, noble capital migrated out of ships and cargoes and into terra firma estates on the mainland, villas, vineyards, grain land, safe rents. You can read the shift in the architecture. Palladio's villas along the Brenta are, among other things, the balance sheet of a merchant class converting risk capital into landed income. The sons of men who had haggled in Alexandria became landlords collecting rent in Padua. Individually, every one of those decisions was rational. Collectively, they were the city deciding, without ever voting on it, that its future was behind it. A trading empire whose elite no longer trades is a bank whose partners have moved their own money out. The fourth warning sign arrived in 1509, and for a few weeks it looked like the end coming early. The League of Cambrai, the Pope, France, the Holy Roman Emperor, Spain, and assorted Italian powers, essentially everyone with an army, united for the specific purpose of carving up Venice's mainland territory. At Anadello in May 1509, the French shattered the Venetian army in an afternoon, and nearly the entire terra firma fell away within weeks. Machiavelli wrote that, in one day, Venice lost what had taken 800 years to build. The Republic survived, the lagoon held, the coalition quarreled, diplomacy and money clawed most of the territory back within a few years. But something in the city's posture changed permanently. After Cambrai, Venice played defense. It stopped reaching and started preserving. There is a version of that moment in every aging financial power. The day the strategy memo quietly changes from grow to protect. And the fifth sign was the banks themselves. The private bench bankers of the Rialto, for all their elegance, kept failing, lending out deposits, getting caught in wars and bad sovereign loans. The House of Pisani and Tiepolo went down in 1584. So in 1587, the Republic did something genuinely ahead of its time. It founded the Banco di Rialto, a public bank, deposits backed in full, transfers by ledger entry guaranteed by the state. In 1619 came the Banco del Giro, which settled state obligations the same way. And bank money in Venice was so trusted, it often traded at a premium to physical coin. These were real innovations. Economists still cite them as ancestors of central banking. But notice what they were. They were superb plumbing bolted onto a shrinking house. Venice kept perfecting the mechanics of money, while the trade that gave the money something to do drained away toward Lisbon, Antwerp, Amsterdam, and London. By the mid-1600s, English and Dutch ships were carrying goods into the Mediterranean, into Venice's own sea, more cheaply than Venetian ships could. The ledger was immaculate. The entries were getting smaller, and the last entry in the Republic's own books was already being drafted in a language no one on the Rialto spoke, French, though no one would read it aloud for another century and a half. The collapse, when you lay it on a timeline, is less a crash than a long exhale. After Candia bled the treasury through 1669, Venice managed one final military flourish. Francesco Morosini reconquered the Morea, southern Greece in the 1680s, and the Republic held it just long enough to lose it back to the Ottomans by the Treaty of Passarowitz in 1718. That treaty is a decent tombstone for Venice as a power. From 1718 onward, the The Republic was formally, officially neutral, because neutrality was all it could afford. The 18th century city that tourists fell in love with, Vivaldi, Casanova, Canaletto, the masked carnival running for months, was running on accumulated capital in every sense, still rich by the standards of a fading rentier. The arsenal that had once launched a galley a day was building a handful of ships a year. The fleet that had fought Lepanto with over 100 galleys could barely man a squadron. The patrician register had thinned so badly that the state took to selling nobility outright. Entry to the Golden Book for 100,000 ducats. And even then, by the 1790s, a large share of the remaining noble families were poor, the so-called Barnabotti, aristocrats on public relief. A state that sells its governing class by the seat is publishing its own liquidation notice. Then came the afternoon. In 1796 and 1797, the French Revolutionary armies under a 27-year-old Napoleon Bonaparte fought the Austrians up and down the Venetian mainland, and the Republic's neutrality meant both armies marched across its territory as if it were no one's. When Venetian subjects in Verona rose against French troops in April 1797 and shore batteries on the Lido fired on a French ship, Napoleon had his pretext. He reportedly declared he would be an Attila for the Venetian state. The Senate's response was not resistance, it was arithmetic. The city had perhaps a few thousand reliable troops and a navy that existed mostly on paper. The French had the most effective army in Europe within sight of the lagoon. On the 1st of May, the government began negotiating its own dissolution. On the 12th of May, 1797, the Great Council met for the last time. The Republic's constitution required 600 patricians for a quorum. Contemporary accounts say only 537 were present, many having already slipped out of the city. As musket fire, probably departing Dalmatian soldiers firing a salute, mistaken for the start of an attack, rattled outside, the council voted 512 to 20, with 5 abstentions, to abolish itself. 1,100 years of the Republic of St. Mark ended by a show of hands taken in a hurry. The last Doge, Ludovico Manin, the 120th, walked back to his apartments, took off the corno, the stiff ducal cap his predecessors had worn for a millennium, handed the linen cap from beneath it to his valet, and said, "By the account that has come down to us, take it. I shall not be needing it again. No battle, no siege. The lagoon that had stopped every army since Pepin's Franks in 810 never had to stop this one. The state surrendered to a ledger of its own. Men, ships, ducats, counted, found insufficient, signed away. The aftermath was looting dressed as liberation, and then a brutal accounting joke. French troops occupied the city, planted a liberty tree in the piazza, burned the Golden Book and the Doge's regalia, and stripped Venice of treasure, including the 4 bronze horses of St. Mark, themselves loot from Constantinople in 1204. The dividend of the Fourth Crusade, repossessed after 593 years, the lagoon, you could say, finally ran a true double entry on itself, and the debit side came due. 5 months later, by the Treaty of Campo Formio in October 1797, Napoleon handed Venice to Austria like a poker chip. The Republic, that had outlasted Rome's successors, traded away in a clause. The Banco del Giro's obligations were caught in the wreckage. The public debt was eventually serviced at a fraction of face value under foreign administration. The ducat, by then continued as the zecchino, still essentially the 1284 coin, stopped being struck by a sovereign Venice because there was no sovereign Venice. The money had never failed. The state that issued it had simply stopped existing around it. Venice spent the 19th century as a province, an Austrian naval station, and a romantic ruin for poets, and entered the modern world as what it remains. A city whose chief export is the memory of what it used to be. Here's the part I find hard to shake. the bookkeeping survived. Double entry accounting, public deposit banking, transferable bank money, marine insurance pools, sovereign bonds. Venice's inventions run the modern world every single day. The toolkit conquered the planet. The toolmaker was carved up at a peace conference it wasn't invited to. Which brings us to now, because the reason this story gets told on this channel is not the gondolas. Venice teaches a precise lesson. Monetary integrity and geopolitical permanence are two different assets, and one cannot be spent to buy the other. The ducat was, by any measure, the most successful currency project of the last 1,000 years, and it bought Venice exactly 0 years of extra existence once the trade routes moved and the elite cashed out. In 2025 and 2026, the parallels write themselves, and you don't need to force them. A reserve currency network, the dollar system, clearing through a handful of institutions, settling most of global trade, works on the same logic the ducat and the rialto ledgers did. Everyone uses it because everyone uses it, and the network feels like a law of nature, right? Up until participants begin, even slowly, building routes around it, the way Lisbon built a route around the Red Sea. Some central banks have been adding gold at the fastest pace in decades. Alternative settlement arrangements get announced every year. Most go nowhere. History suggests choke points erode over decades, not weekends. But Venice's planners also had a comfortable decade between Da Gama's first voyage and the empty warehouses at Alexandria. Choke point trade routes are back in the headlines too. A meaningful share of global trade still squeezes through the Suez Canal, the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, the Panama Canal. And recent years have shown how fast shipping reroutes at enormous cost when a choke point stops being safe. Venice was a choke point business that assumed the choke point was permanent. And then there are the financial centers themselves, the cities, whose towers assume the transactions will always clear through them, even as their own capital quietly migrates into safe assets, property, and rent, the way patrician money slid out of galleys and into Palladian villas. When a financial center's elite stops funding ventures and starts collecting rent, the 18th century has already begun, whatever the calendar says. None of this is a prediction. No one can tell you whether any modern system is in its 1500 or its 1790, and anyone who claims that certainty is selling something. But the Venetian pattern raises the question worth sitting with. When the moment comes, does a great financial power fall in a crisis you can see? Or does it do what Venice did and simply fade for 300 years while everyone inside admires how perfectly the books still balance? If you want to see what happens when the opposite goes wrong, when the state survives but the money itself dies in a matter of months, watch our episode on the collapse that turned a continent's strongest currency into wallpaper. The ledger, as always, is open.